Hi everyone, my name is Professor Warren, and today we'll be talking about fallacies of argument. So, as we've all been aware, right, we've been talking about ways to create good arguments which utilize a mixture of ethos, pathos, and logos. So today we're going to talk about fallacies, and if we want to just sort of very quickly define the word fallacy, it's mostly like what I have here. It's a mistaken belief, especially based on an unsound argument. So essentially, if you want to remember the word fallacy, it's essentially, bad arguments. And they're bad because either they're, mistaken ideas or belief, or there's an element in there, in that argument, that just doesn't hold up under scrutiny. And for our purposes, we'll be looking at the ways in which you can use ethos, logos, and pathos in such a way that creates a detrimental argument versus using them in a way that makes your argument sound and reasonable. So let's start with pathos, because I think this is the easiest one, which are emotional fallacies. I think these ones are the easiest ones to understand why they tend to not work sometimes. The first one is scare tactics. And this is when you use or make an argument in which you're just trying to coerce public opinion through scaring them. You see this a lot with PSAs. I wish I could play some, but I'm afraid of on YouTube being copyright struck because I've already had that happen once, even though this is educational. But think of any PSAs that you have where they're like, don't smoke, or, they show somebody like blowing up or something out of this world, right? That likely doesn't really happen in real life, but it's just made to sort of scare you, right, into action versus actually making an argument to deter you from doing that. It's trying to just evoke fear in order to get you to do what they want. So think of PSAs when we think of scare tactics. The next one is either or choice fallacies or the false dilemma fallacy. And so this is when people try to take complicated arguments and they simplify it, but they're simplifying it in a way that either hides alternatives or it's just made to sort of trick you. There is another version of that where somebody takes something that's very simple and they make it overly complicated to try to trick you or hide alternatives. But right here, we're just focusing more on when people take complicated ideas and they try to simplify it, but by doing so, they're hiding alternatives. So what do I mean by that? Let's look at this example. If you are against going to war, then you must hate our troops. Just by looking at this, right, we can already see that they're trying to take a complicated idea like war, right? Because war isn't just, war itself, right? When people in a country, or sorry, when countries go to war, this usually will impact the economy and impacts people's individual lives. It impacts the community's lives from which those people come from. It impacts industry. It impacts all these different things. And so you can't just say, hey, right, if somebody doesn't want to go to war, then they automatically hate troops. That doesn't equate, right? Maybe they don't like going to war because it will detriment the economy, right? Or maybe they don't want people to go to war because they don't want people to die, right? It's not as simple as that. And you can kind of see that either or in that, right? Either, right, you're for going to war, therefore you love troops, or either if you decide to go against us, go against war, then you must hate troops, right? You can kind of see that either or fallacy in there. Slippery slope. So this one's often used quite a bit. This is when, you say that, oh, if we do this small thing, right, it will have this huge impact on something later in life. And oftentimes that's not true. People use a slippery slope fallacy in order to exaggerate and frighten people. It's kind of like scare tactics, but the focus of that argument is they're like, oh, if you do this small thing, kind of like the butterfly effect, right? If you kill a butterfly now, it's going to lead to World War III. Right? There's no connection between those two ideas. I have an example here. This was actually something that my history teacher in high school used to say, and it's always stuck with me, but he used to say, if you cheat on a test, you'll cheat on your spouse. Right? Even though they're about cheating on a test is not equating to, cheating and ruining, emotional bonds in a relationship with your beloved, right? So definitely that would be an example of a slippery slope where you're saying this small, maybe insignificant thing will lead to, you exaggerate that it'll lead to something larger in life. And again, these are all emotional fallacies, right? There's no logic being brought in. There's no real substance to it. They're just trying to use emotions to coerce you into doing these. Overly sentimental appeals, very straightforward. You use excessive emotion to get what you want. So think of children. Children can't articulate themselves, right? They can't say, oh, well, I should have chocolate because, chocolate has antioxidants and, what have you. If a child wants chocolate, they will cry, they will scream, they will stamp their feet until they get what they want. So overly sentimental appeals, think of children begging for candy. And then bandwagon appeal. So this is essentially that you should accept or reject an argument solely on the fact that other people either accept or reject that. So it's like jumping on the bandwagon. You're doing it because everyone else is doing it. And sometimes that is, depending on the situation, sometimes it does work, right? Usually the general populace does make good decisions, but, not all the time. You should still be critical. So my example is those fitness and health trends, because we know from scientific research, right, that, moderate exercise, making sure your diet is balanced, those are typically what's going to keep you healthy. But you see health trends and fitness trends where, a celebrity in their group jumps on the bandwagon, and then you're like, oh, well, so-and-so in their group is doing it, therefore I should go on keto, therefore I should do this, therefore I should do that. See it all the time, don't eat red meat, eat red meat. Go on keto, don't go on keto, stuff like that. So bandwagon appeals, you're either doing something or rejecting something because everyone else is doing that. Now let's go to ethical fallacies. This is the part of arguments that utilize your character or your credibility to appeal to you. And again, there's nothing wrong with having credibility and when you're making an argument, telling your audience, saying, hey, right, I have 15 years experience in this field, or I have my degree in this field. However, there are ways that people use their credibility or character in a way that doesn't really work for argumentation, and it sort of falls through. So the first one is appeals to false authority. So this is somebody who's not qualified, and they try to make claims as if they are qualified. So oftentimes, think of weird celebrity advertisements. One of the ones I think of is back in the day, Michael Jordan used to do commercials for McDonald's. That to me would be an example of an appeal to a false authority, because somebody like Michael Jordan, it would make sense if he endorsed, his shoe brand or maybe a fitness drink or fitness equipment, because he, that's his sort of claim to authority is fitness, right, in sports. But it's weird with him endorsing a very unhealthy fast food, high fat, high sodium product, right? So that would be an appeal to false authority. There are people that do this very sneakily. There are people that have PhDs, because again, just because you have a PhD does not mean that you are an ethical person. Hopefully you are, but sometimes that's not the case. And there have been times where people have like a PhD in English, and then they are recruited to do a medical advertisement. And it's like, oh, they have a PhD, but it's not a doctorate. So what is their claim to authority? You'll see this sometimes where it's like, oh, I have a degree or I have a doctorate, but it's not even in the thing that they're endorsing. So there's another example for you. Let's look at dogmatism. So this is an appeal that uses one's own doctrine in a way that it's like, well, you have to accept my conclusion beyond reasonable question because it's my own doctrine. You often see this a lot with religion, where people will say, if their religion's being attacked or they feel their religion's being attacked, they say, well, we have to accept it because my religion says so, and that's the end of that conversation. Obviously, that is not a logical argument, it's not a reasonable argument, and this isn't me attacking religion, but it's not a good argument to make, for or against your religion. But setting religion aside, you can also see this with companies as well, when companies claim that their product is the best. So they'll say, if we're using generic soap company, let's just call it generic soap company so nobody gets mad at me. If generic soap company said our soap is the best on the market and no other soap is good, that would be dogmatism, where it's like, you have to accept our doctrine because it is the only acceptable conclusion because I said so. And it's not true. Ad hominem. So this is when people attack other people, and it's usually in a personal way rather than actually attacking their argument. Now, there are times when it is good to argue and say, hey, right, your credibility, if somebody's speaking about, business and finance and they're trying to sell you an online course and they've been arrested for defrauding people, that's a good time to bring in their character, right? However, this is when you're really attacking them in a way that's personal, that's not really attacking their argument. And so I have this example. We cannot approve of this recycling idea. It was thought of by a bunch of hippie communist weirdos. So again, as we can see here, are they attacking the recycling idea? No, they're not doing that. There's nowhere in here are they breaking down their recycling idea. They're attacking their character. They call them a bunch of hippie communist weirdos. And that may have nothing to do with this idea of recycling, because again, generally people from different demographics usually agree that recycling is good. So attacking their character isn't attacking their argument. It would make more sense to say, hey, right, maybe we can't do the recycling idea because of XYZ, right? So it's ad hominem, you're attacking someone, usually personally. You see this on the internet all the time where they're like, oh, we can't listen to that person because they're ugly or they're fat or something like that. And then lastly, stacking the deck. Again, I always like to remember this like cards. It's sort of in the name, stacking the deck. This is where you are making an argument where you only have evidence in there that supports your idea and you reject any evidence that would contradict you. So you either ignore it or just reject it. So again, kind of like cards. If you're playing cards and you're trying to cheat, you'll have a deck of cards where you've got all the cards in there that could help you win, and you throw out the ones that would make you lose. And so you see that a lot with propaganda. Propaganda does that quite a bit, where they only show you the positives of their either country or their beliefs or their ideology or their position, and they throw out any other negative. So again, if we think about war, kind of like we did with the fallacies of emotional arguments, right? That sort of kind of works hand in hand, where somebody may not want to go to war because people die, but in a propaganda poster, you wouldn't see that. You would see heroic, stoic figures fighting for one's country. They don't even attempt to even showcase that other position. They take out all of those, they ignore any other positions, and they're like, hey, look, here's this evidence as to why you should believe it. So that's called stacking the deck. Lastly, let's talk about logical fallacies. So these are arguments that attempt to use logic or reasoning. However, they do so in a way that just doesn't work out. So here are a few that I've pulled out. Now this one's going to be a little bit longer because people tend to use more logical fallacies, at least from what I've experienced, because logic and reason do appeal to people most of the time, but these are ways in which that logic fails. So the first one is a hasty generalization. So this is conclusions drawn from insufficient information. So think about study sizes that are not sufficient, that represents an entire population. So say, for instance, I went outside and the first 5 people that walked past me, I asked them, do you like wearing hats? And say like 4 out of 5 of those people said no, they don't like wearing hats. Well, if I then took that information and said, oh, Americans are not wearing hats anymore, right? That would be a hasty generalization. That study size is not representative of the actual population. Again, I'm asking people only in my area, right? Things like that. So it's not enough to then draw a conclusion because it's just insufficient data. Faulty causality is the next one. So this one is, it falsely assumes that one event caused another event. So say, for instance, right, somebody says, every time I wear these shoes, it rains. Now, is it because that person, every time they wore those particular shoes, that it rains? No, just a coincidence, right? Or maybe they just never realized until very lately, and maybe their entire life was having those shoes. That wasn't the case. I had a friend growing up in high school that ran track, and he would wear these particular socks, and he believed that if he wore the socks, he would win his race. And again, he was a very good track runner, But there were times he wore those socks and he didn't win. He only focused on the times in which he did win when he was wearing those socks. And trust me, those socks were pretty gross. The next one is begging the question, and it's sort of in that name. It's an appeal that assumes the truth of an unproven claim and avoids providing evidence for that claim. So I have an example of that. So let's see. UFOs exist because I've had experiences that could only be classified as UFOs. So what in that, first off, is it assumes the truth of an unproven claim. UFOs exist. That is the unproven claim. Even though, I've had students like, well, the US government said that UFOs exist. I mean, yeah, but again, UFO stands for unidentified flying object. We're talking about, little green men, right? So UFOs exist. That's an unproven claim, right? And then they go on to say, well, UFOs exist, which is an unproven claim, because I've had experiences that could only be classified as UFOs. And again, they fail to provide evidence. Personal anecdotes, so personal examples, are not good pieces of evidence. They can be circumstantial evidence or, maybe help to build with other stronger evidence. But humans, one of the things people don't realize, humans often hallucinate quite a bit. We do that quite a bit, actually. Not only that, but did that person try to do more tests to figure out if it was actually UFOs or a weather balloon, right? There's so many different things that person could do. And they seem to just be really biased. They're like, oh, I already believe in UFOs, therefore this thing I saw must be UFOs, right? There's no real good evidence to support their claim. So that's begging the question. And again, it's in the name, right? They have the unproven claim, and you're like, well, what evidence do you got? And they're like, well, it's my experience. And it's like, well, anything else? What else do you got, right? And they failed to provide that. Equivocation. So this is an appeal that uses a key term or phrase in a vague way that creates a fallacy. So this is an example right here from when George W. Bush was president. He was asked, does the United States torture? Do we torture prisoners of war? And he exclaimed, the United States does not torture. So looking at that, that may seem logical, right? Well, he says that they don't, torture, but this would be an equivocation fallacy because the vague key term there is the word torture, right? I can use torture in a sentence like if, say, for instance, I'm taking a math test. I could say, oh, this test is torture. And I could also use it in the same way as, oh, nailing somebody to a pole and beating them with a rod, that is torture, right? It's a very vague term that we kind of use for multiple different situations. And so that would be equivocation. And to George W. Bush, right, the U.S. did torture, right? They do torture. They did waterboarding. But for George W. Bush, waterboarding was not considered torture. He used that in a vague way to manipulate his audience, being like, well, we don't torture, until you press him on it, and it's like, well, that's not my definition of torture. So that'd be equivocation. Here's a few more. We have non sequiturs, which is basically your argument, the claims you make, and the reasons. They don't connect logically to sort of the conclusion of that. So let's look at this. People generally like to walk on the beach. Is that a reasonable claim? Yeah. I'm not saying everybody likes to walk on the beach, right? I'm saying people generally, right? You can go to the boardwalk and see people out there walking the beach, right? People generally like to. That makes sense. Beaches have sand. Is that true? Yeah, beaches have sand. Therefore, having sand floors in homes would be a great idea. Now, is that reasonable? Probably not. If you've ever gotten, sand in your car, good luck. It ain't never coming out, right? So that would be a non sequitur where you have two claims, right? Generally people like to walk on the beach and beaches have sand. Those two claims are reasonable, right? You don't really need to do, giant scientific studies. They're just reasonable, right? But the conclusion that you draw from them is not reasonable, and that's a non sequitur. A straw man. So a straw man is a very popular one. It's when you fail to address the proposition in question by misrepresenting your opposition. So in order to understand it, let's look at this example. Caroline says that she thinks her friends should not be so rude to the new girl. Jenna says that she cannot believe that Caroline is choosing to be better friends with the new girl than the girls who have always known her. Now, is what Jenna said true to Caroline's position? Jenna says that she can't believe Caroline is being better friends with the new girl. Is that true? Was that Caroline's position? No. Caroline's position was, hey, we shouldn't be so rude to the new girl. And Jenna did not accurately represent Caroline's position. She said, oh, I can't believe that Caroline would choose this new girl over her friends that she's known forever. That would be a straw man. You want people to attack the proposition, right? In Jenna's case, she wants people to attack that Caroline is being better friends with the new girl versus what Caroline's actual position is. So that would be a straw man. The next one is a red herring. You've probably heard of this one. This is when you draw attention from the real issue and you want people to focus on an irrelevant issue. So for instance, we have Andy and his aunt here. So here's Andy. Hey, what's with all this junk food you bought? You're always railing at me about eating healthy. His aunt responds saying, don't fuss, it was on sale. So, what is the relevant issue, right? The relevant issue is what Andy says. His aunt always gets mad at him when he buys unhealthy food. However, let's look at what the aunt does. She then says, oh, well, don't argue with me, it was on sale. So what she's hoping is that Andy will divert his attention away from his original argument, which is, hey, you always get on to me for eating junk food. She wants him to attack the idea that, hey, it was on sale. By doing this, it diverts your audience's attention from the real issue and has them attack something that's really not relevant, right? It doesn't matter that it was on sale, right? His aunt always gets mad at him for buying junk food. And oftentimes people will do that in a very sneaky way because they don't actually want you to focus on the real issue. They want you to focus on an irrelevant issue. This way they never have to address the actual issue. So the aunt doesn't want to address that she's always mean and railing at him about junk food. She wants him to focus more on, that it was on sale and have him sort of break that down. This way she doesn't have to address the situation. It's a very sneaky one. Faulty analogy. So this is an appeal that assumes that just because two things are alike in one or more aspects, that they're alike in other aspects. So for instance, I have this example. Making people register their own guns is like the Nazis making the Jews register with their government. This policy is crazy. Now, should be very clear that registering an inanimate object is not the same as registering people, right? That is a faulty analogy. There is no connection between those two. Just because they share that term, registering, does not mean that they're the same. There was a meme I saw actually where the meme said horses and alligators were the same creature. And what they did was they pointed out all the ways that they're similar. So they said, oh, horses and alligators have big snouts. They live on the planet Earth and they don't have to pay taxes. Therefore, they're the same creature. That would be a good example of another faulty analogy because, yes, they do have those things, but you're ignoring everything else that makes them different creatures, right? That would be a faulty analogy. Another one is paralipsis. This is a form of irony. And again, irony is just, irony is sort of, for instance, if the fireman's house burns down, right? That's irony. It's something that you didn't anticipate to happen, but happens, right? We're all on the same page, right? Irony. Paralipsis is a form of that irony. It's a rhetorical device of giving emphasis by professing to say little or nothing about a subject. So let's look at this example. I'm not saying that you can't bring your dog to my house, but I'm allergic. So, again, if paralipsis is saying, hey, I'm going to say I'm not going to say anything about it, but you're actually doing that, how do we see that in this example, right? Did that person technically say, don't bring your dog to my house? No, they didn't technically say you cannot bring your dog to my house, but are they actually saying you can't bring your dog to your house? Yeah, by that little thing at the end, but I'm allergic, right? Therefore, you're not going to do that and be a jerk. Well, hopefully not, right? So that's paralipsis, where you're like, oh, I say I'm not going to say it, but you're actually saying it. Similar here. Certain politicians do that a lot on Twitter, and I'll leave it at that. Do a lot of paralipsis. So that's all I have today for logical fallacies. And again, are these the only logical fallacies that exist? Absolutely not. There are so many different ways that people construct arguments that do not make sense, or there's just something in there that doesn't work right. However, our focus today was on the ways in which you can use ethos, pathos, and logos. Again, emotional arguments, arguments utilizing credibility or character, and arguments utilizing logic or reason in a way that just doesn't work out because of those elements in some way, shape, or form. And again, are there multiple different ways to construct bad arguments? Of course there are. These are the ones that I feel you're going to see the most often, and so that's why we're covering them. So make sure that you go through these, take some notes, and be aware of when you do these as well, or when others do these. These can be a good way, instead of, trying to debunk every little thing. If you already can put a face to the name, you can say, well, that's not a good argument because you're making a red herring, right? Or, hey, you're using paralipsis, right? Which is you profess to say it, but you're actually saying it, right? So definitely these are very good sort of mental defenses against bad arguments, and being able to understand them helps you protect yourself in real life, and something that we have to learn for our class. So hopefully that you learned something and you're able to identify these in your educational and your real life experiences. And if you have any questions, as always, ask me, send me an email, put it in our Q&A forum, or, just contact me in some way, shape, or form. Okay? Have a great rest of your day. I'll see you in class. And yeah, have a good one.